Big complex problems don't necessarily have to be overwhelming. My guest and applied anthropologist, Ellie Snowden, harnesses the power of small stories to help people in organizations turn big intractable problems into manageable ones. She argues that one-size-fits-all solutions don't work. Instead, we can create much more impactful interventions by quickly gathering many small and granular stories related to a complex problem, and then bring together multiple expert perspectives to envision the best path forward. The approach employed by Ellie and her colleagues is helpful in identifying what is truly needed to effectively address a big complex problem, while opening fresh possibilities for the future. In this conversation, Ellie and I discuss her unique approach to work at the kuh-nev-in company, how she uses a software tool called SenseMaker to gather stories and facilitate collaborative problem-solving work, how studying medical anthropology, yoga, and massage has shaped her approach to her work, and her take on embodied knowledge, humanizing business, and doing meaningful work. Let's dive in. Ellie, welcome to Making Business Hard. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We're going to touch on your work. We're going to touch on your training in anthropology. But the first thing I'd like to just ask you a question about, being that you have a Welsh background and you work at a company with a Welsh name, and I haven't come across many Welsh people in person before. So tell us about this word kuh-nev-in. Like, what does this Welsh word kuh-nev-in mean? And I know it's a wiggly word, so just your best definition of the word as you understand it.
Thank you. An excellent pronunciation, by the way. So many people say it in very different ways. So the word kuh-nev-in, it's spelt Cynefin, in case anyone has a desire to look it up. So I actually was looking into this in a little bit more detail the other day. So there's many origins through which this word has come from. But it seems that there's a story around this word kind of originally coming from the habitual tracks made by animals as they walk through the earth over time, right? So it evokes this sense of belonging across time and place. And the way that my dad, Dave Snowden, uses it in the context of his framework that he's called the kuh-nev-in framework is this phrase, my place of multiple belongings. So in any one moment in time as a human being, I'm taking on a whole multitude of roles, depending on what context I'm in, who I'm surrounded by, any expectations there might be on me. And this sense that we're never just one thing. There's always a multitude of things.
So personally, what's one thing you would point to as your kuh-nev-in?
Ooh, my kuh-nev-in. Well, I guess seeing as you've mentioned my kind of Welsh roots, right? It's not a place that I've ever lived, but it's a place that we visited a lot as children. My grandparents lived there. Obviously, my dad originated from there. And there's a particular beach that we used to go to. And I've been there a lot as a child. I've been there on my own as an adult. And as soon as I sit on that beach and my feet are in the water and I'm looking out to this expanse ahead of me, it's called Newborough Beach, by the way. It's gorgeous. I feel so connected to all those who have come before me. All these childhood memories come up that I've seemingly forgotten, that are so attached to this place and everything else that I relate to it through. And it just holds a great significance for me.
Oh, that's beautiful. So you have not spent much time in Wales. What different cities have you lived in as you were growing up with your dad? Because I think your dad worked in different places.
Yes.
As you were growing up, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, my dad was travelling all around the world when we were younger, which was great when we were kids because we quite often got to go with him. So we got to experience lots of different cultures, lots of different types of food and customs around eating, which I just loved as well. But as for me personally, I've lived in a few places, mainly in the UK. I'm currently based in Bristol, which is in the southwest. It's a town of a really lovely size for me. I grew up in a tiny little village surrounded by woodland. So Bristol is this lovely place where you've got the kind of buzz and the social life of a city, but you've got lots of lovely escapes into nature that are very kind of quick and easy to get to from your doorstep. So I've been here for a little while. I've just returned here after a stint in London. And I also lived in Ibiza in Spain for a little bit post-pandemic as well. The other place that I've lived is Brighton, which is where I studied anthropology for about 5 years at the University of Sussex. So all the place names beginning with B, it seems.
So let's get into our conversation. And one question that I'd like to start with, now listen carefully, is where do you work and what do you get paid to do?
Where do I work? Well, we work a little bit here, there, and everywhere. It's slightly hard to place us. We're a small little team. I think we're about 20 odd people, but we are based across the world. So there's about 3 of us that are in the UK. We've got a couple more consultants dotted around Europe. We've got about 3 or 4 people in South Africa, and also a whole team in Singapore as well. And in the kind of 8 years that I've been working in an organisation, our geographic locations have also expanded to the States and other parts of the world as well. So I like to refer to us as small but fairly globally spread. So we all work remotely, which creates a wonderful sense of kind of personal freedom in terms of how we define our time. But also, of course, comes with some of the challenges that we get from that remote working lifestyle where you lose that face-to-face connection. So we're based all over, really. And how do I make my money? Well, as an organisation, we specialise in bringing together some principles from complexity theory with what I refer to as narrative inquiry. So bringing together story with theory. And we work with organisations, with communities, in commercial contexts, in research contexts, a very diverse portfolio of people that we work with. But the kind of underlying thing that unites our clients is this desire to explore some of the more kind of intractable or wicked issues of our time. Some of the problems that we might face in our communities and our organisations that don't necessarily have an explicit answer or way forward, that we can't kind of predefine where we want to get to from because there's an inherent uncertainty or unpredictability. For me, it's the places where humans are humans and people allow them to be such, this idea of kind of messiness that comes in.
So you already touched on this, but so tell me more about what distinguishes kuh-nev-in's approach to navigating and addressing complex problems versus maybe competitors or some other more standard Big Four type of consulting outfits.
Yeah, so I think the thing that really makes us different from the rest is this idea of bringing story into the work that we do. And when I mentioned story or narrative in this context, it's really the kind of the micro narratives, the stories that we share in our day-to-day, the stories that we share in our relationships with others quite naturally without being overly prompted, the kind of anthropological way of working with how we describe our day-to-day realities, or as I like to kind of call it, the magic in the mundane. So we work with a specific type of complexity that my dad refers to as anthro-complexity, right? Because there's all sorts of ways of defining complexity out there, ranging from the kind of more computational, looking at things at a really grand scale, the nodes and the lines that connect, drawing patterns from those kind of ways of more mathematical inquiry, to looking at biological complexity, the complexity within our interior landscapes. And we're very much about looking at this kind of social ecology of interactions, allowing for that, as I say, messiness, that kind of bramble bushes in the thicket sense of looking at this. And of course, there is just such a whole broad range of work now around complexity and systems thinking, with all sorts of different approaches to it. But the way that Nora Bateson describes the approach that we would take or that she would take is that sometimes complexity can be that uncle at a dinner party that you're not quite comfortable with. He brings all the wrong things in and it's not neat and tidy, and it gives you that kind of like, oh, we've got to deal with this in a slightly different way. Yeah, so the very kind of human things around complexity that can't necessarily be understood from kind of a monolithic or a top-down approach. But we also have kind of specific software that we call SenseMaker that is unique to us, where we work with these everyday narratives that people are sharing. And we also combine those with these kind of higher level patterns or attitudes or ways of thinking and doing and being in a certain space that are defining what is possible to see and do.
So just to let some thinking of our listeners, and they may not be familiar with complexity or some of these other concepts. So to like ground this explanation in an example, what might be one or two like high level examples of problems that kuh-nev-in has helped to address in the last year or two?
So an example that I can bring in maybe from my area of work, I do a lot of work in health with healthcare professionals, might be around this idea of burnout and stress, right? So where does stress lie? Where does burnout originate from? How do we prevent it? What does it mean in practice? And a lot of the time when we think about ideas that relate to health, to well-being, we might fall upon a fairly individualized understanding of that. So I am stressed. This is my body's response to something. It might be to do with my behavior, or there's some kind of an approach that will reside within me that I can take to address this and to move forwards. Our approach to understanding something like stress or burnout would be to say, yes, this is really important. But what are some of the kind of wider factors in the relationshiping, in the systems, that are making stress more of a kind of distributed property of the system or systems that we're interacting within, for example? So an example that I can bring in to maybe make this a little bit clearer. I was working with a healthcare team on a surgical ward, and they were doing all their kind of employee well-being surveys, which were Likert scales, how stressed are you, all these things around teamwork, and they were getting really low scores. But the surveys that they were doing, although they were getting a high response rate, they weren't really telling them what it was that was causing that in the first place. And I mean, we know that healthcare is a very under-resourced area. We know that it's high stress, but just by knowing that doesn't necessarily mean that you know what to do about it, right? And I think quite often when we talk about complexity, or what I notice in clients when we bring this in just as a word, it can create a sort of discursive closure where people either go, oh, it's complex, full stop, or there's this huge overwhelm from, okay, well, it's too complex for us to do anything about it. So the way that we work is to understand these issues, these ideas, on a more granular way by bringing in lots of different perspectives. Because one of the kind of ideas behind complexity is that we're working, as I said, with this uncertainty. There's an unpredictability. If we do A plus B, it's not necessarily always going to create C. And quite often, we actually don't have enough knowledge of what's going on in this kind of thick present to know where to go from here, right? And we can predefine our criteria of success and say we want to reduce something or increase something, or out of all the best intents. But how is it that we move from here? So we worked with this surgical team, and we slowly, bit by bit, gathered all these stories. And it was really interesting because initially we were getting stories from very junior members of the team who were referring specifically to how they were feeling around really stressed, rude, aggressive surgeons who they described as sort of ricocheting off of the wards, shouting at people, not really listening, creating a really kind of toxic or inhospitable working environment. And so when we were working with this organisation, the kind of first response was, well, we need to do some kind of a behavioural initiative. This isn't okay. This isn't how we interact with our people. This is an abusive hierarchy. We know that things are stressful, but this isn't okay. And I think an element of that is true. But I think when you excavate deep, there's always a possibility to bring in a little bit more compassion as to where this comes from, right? So over time, originally we were collecting stories, as I said, just from the junior members of the team. But over time, we managed to work with some of the surgeons as well and really hear what life was like for them at this moment in time. And I'll never forget this story that came through from one surgeon. And he said, the way that my working day is organised has shifted so dramatically in the last month that I now have hardly any contact time with my patients. I'm feeling really out of control because I don't know what's going on. I'm more reliant on the junior members of the team now to feed me information, but this isn't happening and I don't understand why. I know that my stress is having an impact on the team, but I do not know what to do. So it was a really interesting thing because these different perspectives it can be quite easy when we read a story to fall into that because it generates this level of empathy, right? But of course there's a danger of a single story. And our approach is all about kind of tessellating these different experiences to create a richer picture and an understanding of what was going on. And what that enabled in this particular instance was an understanding and therefore an excavation and a kind of reconfiguring of the way that the day was organised, so that it would allow for a little bit more humanity and connection, so that people felt less out of control. That's a bit of a long-winded example. I hope that answered in some way, but feel free to clarify.
Let me play this back to you and see if I follow. And I think also maybe it also helps the audience take like a second pass at this story. So I'm hearing that you have an approach and a toolkit that helps people kind of like really tap into the invisible, into the intangibles, and make that visible and understand all the little bits that feed a problem. And then you stitch together through those insights, then you're able to stitch together an approach or ways to address the problem in a way that really shifts the problem in a certain direction, where there's not, like you were saying, A does not necessarily equal B. B is the result of 10 or 20 or 30 different factors that are then producing this result that we kind of assign causality to like a single thing, or we misperceive or have a misconception of what the real causality is.
Yes.
And then we bring forth a solution that ends up not working because it's not really addressing the causality.
Yes, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And I guess it's some of the principles of complexity. It's this idea of avoiding premature convergence in any action before you've taken that wider perspective around what's going wrong. And a lesson that my dad would always teach me when I was younger, and still does now, and I still learn and make mistakes around, is this idea of, more often than not, people are always acting out of what they seem to be as the best intent. But there's unintended consequences of that. And it's allowing yourself a space for reflection where it's not just you doing the reflection, but there's something reflected back to you as well.
Yeah. I mean, we don't see what we do. I think I was recently coming across some information that something to the effect of every time somebody uses AI, does like an AI prompt, it consumes some quantity of water that's significant per casual use of AI, right? So we're using this tool and maybe getting some benefit or accomplishing something with it. But then all the impact of using that tool is really invisible for us. And we don't have that one-to-one relationship with, well, I'm using AI, but it's consuming like a gallon of water or something like that on the back end that I don't see. And then that has an impact on environments and communities and so forth.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So related to this, I'm just wondering if you encounter misconceptions about kuh-nev-in's work when you're potentially speaking with new clients or you're speaking with leadership in client teams. Are there things that you have to clarify at times, or misconceptions that you have to clear up for people?
Absolutely, all of the time. And there's so many different elements to that, right? And it really kind of depends on the context. But let me try and reflect on one piece that's alive for me in this. I think you mentioned senior leadership. Well, a big part of the work that we do, okay, you're just talking about AI, right? And the scale of information and what happens when we take something from over here, we codify it, we bring it up, and we place it over there. We take it out of its relationships. The meaning shifts somehow as we move between those contexts. And a lot of our work is about creating this space for disintermediated narratives. So how can a senior leader read the story of someone who's been here for a month? And what might that shift, might that ignite in them? So we work with this quite a lot, but of course, that can be received in different ways. And we're playing around with this kind of idea of expert knowledge that is both hierarchical and based on experience and role, but also that is in networks and explorations that are more sensory and in novel perspectives with this. And I think sometimes that can be quite challenging. So that's one element, but also, of course, not every situation is complex. Sometimes we do know what to do. Sometimes you don't need to do these deep dives into chaos or aporia to take yourself on a kind of journey of discovery. And I think sometimes people might want to work with these tools for the wrong reasons, or they might not know what to do with what comes out of it, right? Because we have tools, we have workshop facilitation methods that are designed in such a way that they keep things open and they allow for that emergence to take place. So something that I am learning, and I have made so many mistakes on, is that what happens next. And socializing that and understanding what is possible at this moment in time, what might be possible. Yeah.
I mean, something I learned as I grew in my career, I developed an allergy to best practices, because the concept of the best practice, and this is in context of like nonprofits and collaborating with philanthropy and trying to address really difficult, really wicked social problems. And the best practice is you can copy and paste, but it generally doesn't really work. So, let's take the model from this other place. And these models are usually attached to context, to place, to time, to culture. And at some point I felt like I was living in Groundhog's Day, like the movie. I was like, it's just different year, same conversation, same approach to the solutions, same results that nobody's happy with. Rinse and repeat next year, and it's just crazy making. But I do think like what you're describing is so refreshing, because you are taking an approach that does make space for people to innovate and to create approaches, or at least attempt to create approaches that are appropriate for the place and the time and the people and the culture and like all the other factors present there, but very hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on the best practice, because it's like, why isn't this working? Why has this worked over there and not over here? We talk about this idea of kind of locally actionable insight, and again with this idea of just because it's complex doesn't mean it has to be overwhelming. It's what can we do at this scale? What can we do at that scale within this sphere of influence? What's possible to happen over there? And some of our techniques that are more kind of around sense making, this art of what is possible, revolve around that, right? Thinking about elements in our environment around this topic or this line of inquiry or this problem that we have, and mapping them out to understand what's the energy versus time to change. And like really sitting in that reflective process before defining what happens. And from that, there might be things that I might take away and do differently as an individual this week. That I've seen something in a different way. I'm going to change the way I interact or with someone or approach something. And then there's other things that actually I think I can maybe influence happening over there, or that might take a little bit longer, but I might need a slightly different strategy for. So I think, there's never any kind of one size fits all. And I think there can be a real kind of sense of empowerment when you bring that in, especially when you're working with stories, because it's this sense of kind of using our stock of stories from this time and this place in a way where we can advocate for what's really needed.
Yeah. But what I'm also hearing is that we are asking people to sit in ambiguity, which human beings detest, and have patience, which we don't have a lot of, at least here in the US where I live, and explore a problem instead of making a beeline for a predetermined goal, right? We're doing discovery is what I'm hearing in your description. So acknowledging that, have you developed ways to kind of support or socialize some client teams into transitioning into like having some tolerance or embracing this approach?
Yes. So we try to build this into the way that we might facilitate in a workshop. I'm saying try because it's different in every place and we're always learning. But what we try to do if we are in a facilitated workshop is to kind of set the scene for that up front. When we facilitate, and this is a kind of field of facilitation called complex facilitation, right? So the facilitator has ideally very little interaction with the content that people are generating. So the ownership of the content is the experts in the room, those with lived experience. And the way that we would facilitate to bring in a little bit of that uncertainty, but maybe in a psychologically safe way, might be a little thing like giving one instruction at a time, right? So I'm going to ask you to do this for 10 minutes and then the next thing. Because if you set up front where it is you're looking to get to, people will often race there because that's what we want to do. And I work with a lot of healthcare professionals who are some of the smartest, most intelligent, most caring, compassionate human beings on this planet, right? They've dedicated their lives to helping others. And they know what the answer is. So in our method, sometimes it's maybe this is just an hour where we're in this kind of more reflexive space. And okay, so there's the bringing in little elements of uncertainty within the facilitated process. There's also, for me, this kind of funnel of asking people to start with the descriptive, start with the observational. And this is where narrative comes in, like a prompt where people are asked to describe something that's happened recently, this kind of event, an observation of said event. And staying with the descriptive, it's kind of more powerful for giving you that richness of data, that widening of perspective. It also stops people from jumping into more of a kind of evaluative state too soon. So we might start with this description and then you're invited to make sense of the descriptions of others. And that's when you can get these real I hadn't seen it that way. But we don't tell people that's going to happen. It kind of takes place in it. Yeah.
Yeah. And can we make the distinction about two terms that you mentioned at the top of this description is experts and lived experience. And so by experts, do we mean somebody with 2 PhDs that's in the room, or by expert do you mean somebody who has lived certain experiences, who have rich stories to share, or something else?
Well, it's a both and, I think, for me. Yeah, both and. And I mean, quite often when we facilitate and we're working maybe with quite diverse groups, we might actually kind of really play around with the different types of expertise in the room to maximize them. So that might be that we've got maybe a multidisciplinary team coming in. Some people are very patient-facing or more technical or working in admin or so on and so forth. We might do some grouping so that we are maximizing the kind of groupthink that happens within those roles. So we're using a role as a context in some way. And we might keep those groups separate for that initial descriptive period before then bringing them together and taking them on this kind of discovery walk, if you like, between how the other groups have made sense of exactly the same questions in different ways. So that, for me, is a really interesting way of kind of tessellating different experiences and expertise. But often we are playing with hierarchy, we are playing in very kind of hierarchical environments. And I think the process is much the same there. Because something that we always really value in our organisation, or we try to, is if we have someone who's fairly new, we'll always really encourage them to share their critiques of what's going on, right? Because they can see the things that we cannot see for looking anymore, that we're so used to it, that it's almost invisible to us. But just to go back to your original question, and this is kind of, I think, where my anthropology type stuff comes in. We can think of expertise as something that's codified, it's academic, it's cerebral, it's cognitive, it travels. It's within a kind of legitimate structure of what's right and what's wrong. There's also the lived experience that we have in our day-to-day, in our sensory experiences that nobody else has. That might be considered noise or naivety, but that can also be the kind of learning that we get through curiosity and through observing our environments and the noticing that can come from that. So it's a little bit of both. And sometimes, again, the kind of anthropological mindset is that naivety can tell you things that the longevity maybe can't. But you can't really have one without the other. They're both important.
Yeah. So, and we've been touching on this, but I just wanted to do a recap. So specifically about your work, so you yourself, hands-on doing work, tell me a little bit more about your work at kuh-nev-in and the types of problems you've been helping to address in the past years that you've been there.
So for the past few years that I've been here, I've been focusing more on building a program of work around health and care. So that's been a few different things. So I've done work kind of in the international development sector, working with the Women's Refugee Commission and Plan International to use narrative-based approaches to understand things like what are the drivers for child and early forced marriage in different countries. I've also done work here in the UK within the healthcare system, around amplifying the voices of nurses. So during the pandemic, in a chaotic environment that coronavirus was, where the landscape and everything is just shifting so rapidly, traditional ways of doing research that are quite linear, they might take place over 6 months or a year, and then you have a whole long reporting period, and then you've got recommendations that come out of it. However participatory the approach that you might take to your methodology might be, at that moment in time, everything was changing so quickly that week by week, month by month, everything really looks different. So that particular piece that we did with the Royal College of Nursing, who we're still working with, was to use a more kind of like journaling way of doing research, asking nurses across Northern Ireland and across Scotland to share something from their last week that they really felt mattered and needed to be heard. And that was our opening question, really broad. What matters to you? And from there, we then asked them a series of follow-up questions where they were asked to kind of say where their story sat on this kind of map of concepts. So we were looking at things around, of course, well-being, burnout, but also teamwork. And we worked with their research team to create these kind of real-time feedback loops. So we met every month. We looked at the data, we read the stories, we analysed some of the themes, and then they were able to then feed this back into their policy, into their strategy, into their social media, to share messages back with nurses, to say you're not alone in this, and in various kind of ways. So I guess a lot of the time where I'm working with clients, and they might be really varied, it's in a research context, and it is understanding how do we do research in a way that is perhaps less extractive, in a way where what we gather, what people are willing to share, is then presented back in some way so that the analysis doesn't just fall with one or two expert researchers, but it falls actually with the people who have been bothered to share something that matters to them. And this is where that kind of idea of locally actionable insight comes from, that wider social ecology around making sense of the data. So I've whizzed around quite a few different things there, but let me know if I can clarify anything.
Well, yeah, so let me land a question on another fact here. So you are effectively an applied anthropologist, or that would be somebody who studied anthropology, who's out in industry or nonprofit or government or something similar doing work. So not in the academic space purely. So what are the unique contributions or benefits of applying anthropology, like say your skill set, to kuh-nev-in's work or to any of these problems that you're describing?
Well, I guess the tool that we work with has been described as a kind of distributed way of doing ethnography. So ethnography is the kind of primary method of anthropology. It's around participant observation, going in, well, it used to be about going into a community, to a kind of different world, and really immersing, not just as an observer, but by taking part, by eating food with people, by immersing in rituals, by really being a part of that ecology and not trying to pretend that you're observing in a neutral way. Anthropology has meant many things over the years, and it has a really awful colonial past as well. But the kind of more recent understandings of anthropology and what it brings to this kind of world, I think, is this idea of the power of both observing, but of asking people to share meaning on their own terms. And this is a really big part of what we do at kuh-nev-in with our tool SenseMaker and with our workshopping techniques. Okay, you've shared your story. Now, what does your story mean to you? So in a past life, I worked as a qualitative researcher after I finished studying anthropology. And I worked on a lot of government-funded projects on public policy. And I would be tasked with what they termed as an open-ended interview for an hour, but actually had about 42 different questions that I was supposed to ask someone. And as I was doing this, I just started to notice that I would pick up the phone, I'd welcome somebody into this interview space, and immediately they'd want to tell me why they were there. They'd want to tell me their story. And I would kind of riff off of that. And it would give me so many more questions that weren't on that sheet to ask, and so much more insight. However, of course, there is a politics to research. And when we write our reports, when we decide what makes it and what doesn't, there are objectives within the research plan that have been set out that need to be responded to, and that's really important. But as I discovered in that role, there's also shifts in meaning that come from the intentional and unintentional biases that we have from the perspectives that we're reading these stories or listening to the responses that people share. So our approach, and again, it's not perfect, and I think we'll continue to evolve it, is to work with this idea of epistemic justice. So it's, you've shared your story, now you tell us what the meaning of that story is. Okay, we might have these codes and these themes, but you're telling us the strength of them in relation to this. So what anthropology is really good at is it's linking that micro, that granular, that everyday with the kind of bigger level forces and ideas and macro level stuff that's going on in the world. And what we're inviting people to do here is to share their story and then reflect on it in relation to that higher level. And that can be incredibly revealing. And quite often we're not just asking one particular type of group of people to respond to this, we're also asking the experts to respond to it too. And this works really in some quite interesting ways in health, where we're looking to maybe understand patient journeys or patient experiences from multiple perspectives. Because we can invite people who are entering into a service to share their experiences, but we're also inviting clinicians to share theirs. And quite often we will play around with this idea of revealing these biases in quite a psychologically safe way by showing people the differences in the way that they responded to something and the way that this other person responded to something. And that can have some very interesting results. For some people, that sparks a curiosity and they say, we thought we were being participatory, but actually this might challenge that in some way. Let's go into this, let's explore it. And for others, it can spark I don't think they understood the meaning of their own stories. Which in itself can be interesting.
Yes. Huh. When I'm doing these interviews, I like to take a step back and look back at your journey and explore your journey up to now, and also do that in service of connecting some dots and seeing how some things are influencing the present day. Let's just say that. And so as we have been discussing, you focus your undergrad and graduate studies in anthropology. So I'm curious to hear about what drew you to pursue studies in anthropology in the first place, out of all the choices that you have.
It's such a great question because it's such a niche little subject and it's really hard to define. And certainly at school in the UK, I never even knew it to be a word until I got to my A-levels, which is like the step before university here. And I remember a car journey with my dad. We had a lot of car journeys together when we were younger, which I greatly admire because I would argue with him and we'd have these wonderful debates, and it was just a wonderful way of connecting in that movement container of a vehicle, right? But I remember that I was thinking about what subject to take, and at the time I think I was studying about 5 different things because I hadn't made my mind up for my A-levels. So I was studying English literature and history and photography and psychology and sociology. And I was at this I don't want to give any of these up. They're all giving me so much and I love the way that they all combine together and the way that I can see the world. My dad said, well, have you thought about anthropology? And I said, what on earth is anthropology? And at this point, he had just started doing some work in the development industry with anthropologists, so it was really kind of fresh on his mind. And I think he might have introduced me to 1 or 2 people to chat to so I could unearth more about it. But it just seemed to me this really interesting, it had this kind of air of mysteriousness about it. Like there was so much unknown. I didn't know what it would entail. But it seemed to me a beautiful way of weaving together all these different interests that I had. And I would certainly, and also I have just always had a massive curiosity in people, why we do the things that we do and just observing people in different kind of places. And yeah, it was a very rewarding subject because it's so diverse. It is quite hard to define. We can define it in the way that the subject invites different ways of doing research or inquiring into the world, but there are so many different branches of anthropology. So you can have forensic anthropology, archaeological anthropology, material anthropology, all sorts, and then medical anthropology, which is what I kind of finished my 5 years of study in.
So I did anthropology for undergrad, and I bring in anthropology into my work. So I'm curious, in your case, is there anything in particular, your studies or practice of anthropology, that changed you in some meaningful way?
I feel like it was a constant process of being changed in some meaningful way, which is why I really got off on it and loved it. Because every ethnography, and I'd love to hear your response to this question as well, actually. But every ethnography I read, I would sit back and be like, oh, I hadn't seen it that way. Wow. And it was just this kind of continual process. But the one thing that I really remember was actually when we were studying medical anthropology, because for the first time, we had a really interdisciplinary group. So it was the anthropologists, like those who'd done undergrad and those who were new to it. But also we had loads of med students in there. So we got to kind of live and breathe that othering, or that invitation of, well, have you seen it this way? This is actually the reality of what it's like to learn biomedicine, or so on and so forth. So yeah, those experiences really kind of stood out to me, and I think helped shape me. I gave me a lot of humility as well, because anthropology, as I learnt to discover when I came out of my naive university phase, it is a cultural critique, right? A social critique. And I went to a very left-wing university, a very Marxist university, the University of Sussex, which I loved. But you have this arsenal of ways to, or in my experience, ways to explore, but also kind of attack power dynamics. And then when I went out into the real world, I was like, well, what do I do with this? And it took me a few years to really figure that out, I think. But yeah, I mean, I would love to hear, if it's okay, from you as well, what you took from it.
Honestly, one way that I think about it is I felt that not only anthropology, but the school that I went to, it kind of changed my brain chemistry a little bit in some good ways. So I think one thing it helped me refine, and I continue to refine and work at this, is the art of noticing. So it helped me notice things a lot better and kind of like distinguish patterns. I think that's something my brain already kind of does in some weird way that apparently it's kind of different from people around me, because I'm like, oh, this makes sense, and everybody's like, what are you talking about? Like, well, there's a very clear pattern here, and people are like, say more, because we don't see it. And the other thing, I think the big thing is some training, some way of exercising the ability of stepping back. And like I say to some clients, like recognizing the waters that we're swimming in, like the way it is, and also recognizing that we have somewhat limited contact with reality, meaning we're immersed and living out all these stories of the way things are, and gender roles, or any number of things that we think about people and animals. And there's societies where, at least here in the States, like people, your pet is almost like a child, right?
Yeah.
And I grew up in South America, where dogs, it's like, yeah, pets are pets. They're kind of dirty. They stay outside. They do not sleep with you on the bed or get on the furniture or anything like that. So just different ways of being in the world that is not quite the way it is, but it's more recognizing how we make meaning of things. And anyway, and how that plays out among and between people and bigger groups and so forth. I find it infinitely interesting.
Yeah.
So that's my response to that question. I was just curious what
I love that.
the practice had done to you, because it does change you.
Massively. And I think that what you're sharing about the patterns, I always have appreciated that kind of maybe slightly annoying anthropological thing when you're in a meeting or there's some kind of participatory thing going on and people are talking about a problem. And when people just sit and they listen for about an hour and then they say, well, hang on, what did you mean by that? And what did you mean? And they've observed and then they're saying, okay, well, you're using this term justice. It seems like that means slightly different things. Let's have a conversation about that. And that noticing and that observation is so powerful because it gives that pause, right? And it makes me think a little bit of Alan Watts. Is it Alan Watts? He talks about floodlight and spotlight consciousness. The kind of spotlight where we're really focused in on something and we're seeing it like this. And the floodlight where you're widening out what it's possible to see and maybe sensing into it in different ways. And moving between the two, I guess.
Yeah, and I think I'll do another pass at the question in that it helped me building on what I just shared, I think it also helped me see that with an anthropological mindset, you can, or it can be enabling in opening up a mindset of possibility, because we recognize, oh, things are just not the way they are. The way things are, quote unquote, is something that we're feeding all the time, that we're participating in some way. Whether we like it or not, we participate in the things we don't like, right? Doesn't mean it's our fault. I'm just acknowledging there's a participation there. And that means that then the next thought is, well, then we can participate or direct energy to making meaning in a different way, or just doing something else that's different. It's oversimplified because it's kind of hard to just pick up and build out something completely new or different, but it's possible. Yeah. It's not, there's so many things that are not fixed, at least in the space of social relationships and how we organize society and so forth. Yeah. And then you can argue there's some biology and this and that and the other. And that's all fair and good. But even within that, there's flexibilities in some science. Some listeners might be familiar with, like, well, we have all these organisms that live in our body, and it turns out those organisms also can shape our behaviors or influence how we feel and our mood. Same with the foods that we consume and our choices around that. And then in terms of, when I was studying anthropology back in the day, there was this historical figure from some centuries ago. His last name is Lamarck, that I'm sure you're quite familiar with. And Lamarck, he proposed this idea that what happens to an organism during their lifetime, maybe they lose a limb or they exercise in some way, that kind of gets passed on to the offspring. And then that used to be a laughing stock, like, oh, this guy Lamarck used to believe that, huh? And then more recently, there's the science of epigenetics where researchers find that, oh, wait, no. Things that happen to us do activate or deactivate some genes, or, they bear an influence on our biology. And lo and behold, that gets passed for generations. I think in some mouse study, it was like 7 generations of passing off some anxiety or some trait due to some event that happened to the mice. And it's interesting just to here, just kind of draw a line to beliefs in some societies. So I think there's like some societies in North America, like original peoples of North America, that had that value of making decisions that have an impact on 7 generations. And this idea of 7 generations, that's, to call it something like a more ancient, pre-science, pre-industrial idea, that then turns out that, well, in terms of scientific research, well, it turns out that there is something there. So, anyway, so I'm gonna get like, I'm gonna start to go off to like the 5th dimension here. Yeah, I think it's just really interesting. The anthropology just opens many doors.
So much.
So,
and they have that in Wales, the Future Generations Act. So every new law that's passed has to consider 10 years into the future.
Oh, so enlightened. It's
incredible. And my dad always talks about small nations have more power to do that, right? Smaller nations are often the ones that have been more marginalised in other ways as well, so like New Zealand, Wales, so on and so forth. But we actually did some work with them, not myself, but others, around defining some policy for this Future Generations Act. And they designed a really interesting method of bringing together policymakers and experts, technical experts, with community members of different ages, working in small groups to define ideas for actions. And it's a real interesting one, isn't it? Because the size of the group has an impact on how we might make decisions and how comfortable we feel and how much we trust one another. And I think there's different ways of playing around with that. I've slightly side-quested there, but there was one more thing that I just wanted to mention on the anthropology side of things, because you were talking there, just reflecting back about almost like the kind of disciplinary boundaries and this like need for some disciplines to legitimate themselves by othering themselves against another one, and this like hard, we're this and we're not that. And anthropology for me has really been an invitation to make those boundaries slightly more porous. And there's lots of amazing anthropology that's looked at indigenous knowledges, for example, and understood how certain practices of maybe burning in savannas were condemned or responsible. But then we find that they actually have this huge utility for the ecosystem in terms of its restoration. So I think anthropology just offers this wonderful way of, well, obviously just challenging the things that we take for granted and opening up, as you say, to kind of new ways of seeing things. So yeah.
Yeah. Kind of, that movie, The Matrix, where Neo kind of sees the code. I think anthropology, if you practice it in a certain way, it kind of lets you see a little bit of that in terms of like the social world.
Yeah.
You
I
know?
always think of it a bit like, do you ever read Alice Through the Looking Glass?
All the movies. I was young.
But the books they just invite this. So the books Alice Through the Looking Glass, when I was a kid, I devoured them. I think I read it once a week because it's just this very curious way of looking at the world through a child's eyes. Why is it that adults have designed the world this way? And it pokes fun at it and it's playful. And then you're like, why did we design it this way? This doesn't make any sense.
I know, right? Well, I also know, so here's where I start to diverge and kind of explore other aspects of your background and connect the dots to the present. I know that you pursued studies and certifications in massage therapy and yoga. So I'm just curious to hear about what inspired you to go on those journeys.
Well, a whole number of things. I think, first of all, when I was studying medical anthropology, we were reading a lot around embodied knowledge, around different cultural categorizations of health and illness, but also different modalities of healing. And we would have speakers coming in who were acupuncturists working alongside IVF patients. And that kind of idea of different modalities coming in and complementing one another rather than this othering between them really sparked something in me. And then after a few years, I realized that I had been reading about embodied knowledge and wasn't really doing anything or wasn't really living that out. And I actually, when I was, maybe early or mid-20s, had a really intense stress burnout, which really, I was really just forced to stop for a few months and consider what I was doing. It was like a kind of very early version of a midlife crisis, maybe, I don't know. But during this time, I really found a lot of solace in yoga as a kind of movement therapy. And it gave me a stillness that I don't think I had experienced before. That wasn't a numbing stillness, it was an opening stillness. And I became really interested in this. And I ended up traveling to India. And I did what's called a 200 hours training course, which is this really intense month where you're with about 30 other people and you wake up at 5 a.m. and you finish at 10 p.m. and you do 6 hours of yoga practice, and it's, really intense. But it was this incredible month of deep inquiry that I will always remember. But that led me into wanting to explore the kind of complexity of bodies in a bit more detail, and especially anatomy, right? Because the kind of evolution of our understanding of the anatomy of a body has changed so much, from the very mechanistic metaphors of the pulley system to this idea of myofascia, the kind of entangled webs of communication, and the slings of our body where we can see ourselves in terms of movements rather than muscles. So that led me into taking on some massage training. So I always refer to yoga as my gateway drug into massage. Just because I was keen to learn so much more. So I worked as a massage therapist in Bristol for a good few years before the pandemic. And I did that alongside this job. That was very interesting because, of course, massage offers a completely different way of communicating and of noticing, where there's not really any words. Obviously, you speak with someone before, you ask them what it is that they're after, what's going on, but you're observing the way that someone moves. There's palpation, there is embodied knowledge that you gain through touch. There's a trust that you have to do that. And it was incredibly rewarding. I really enjoyed the sense of calm. It was a very meditative experience to me to offer the massage and to help people understand stress in slightly different ways that weren't just individualizing it. So I kept that anthropology, kept that complexity lens on within this space. Yeah.
So you mentioned embodied knowledge. Can you tell me more about that? Like, what does that mean, or what does that mean to you, at least?
Yeah. So for me, embodied knowledge is, how are we engaging all of our senses in this present moment? We live in a world where over the years, in many cultures, we have valued and prioritized sight over a lot of our other senses. So for me, embodied knowledge is this idea of maybe embodied as embedded. What am I alive to in all of my body? What am I hearing? What am I smelling? What am I touching and palpating? What's there in this moment? And how is that an act of learning? Yeah, and I think for me it ties to this idea of expertise, of lived experience as well, bringing it back to health in a clinical encounter between a healthcare practitioner and a patient. You've got two different epistemological frameworks going on here. You've got one person with this incredible knowledge and this higher level patterning vision where they're asking questions to get a sense of where to place you. And then you've got this messy organism that doesn't speak that same language, that has feelings, that has intents, that has motivations, that has desires, that might be catapulted into certain ways of answering questions that maybe aren't true for that experience, but they have to be moved in some way. And I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. It's making me think of, so where I come from in Ecuador, I was been blessed to know people who just make delicious food, but you could not get a recipe out of them, or not an organized recipe, because their approach to cooking is very embodies, like very much to like to taste, to feel, like when they're so. Some ways, when I was little, when they would cook some desserts, say that are milk based, they would take milk, and at the time, my grandpa, I grew up in my grandpa's house, my grandpa, my grandma, and my mom, and extended family. So he would bring like cow milk, like cow that came straight out of the cow home. And if say person X, that is delicious cook, would make a dessert, like they would take the milk and just boil the milk for hours, like stirring it with a wooden spoon until it got into like a sweetened condensed milk type of thing, or a dulce de leche, which is more, how would you call that in the UK? I have no idea. But the person might say, well, you have, they would say like, well, you have to wait until it gets to a certain point. Cuando alcanza un punto is what they would say in Spanish. And that was like, I can feel like when the mix felt that it was a certain density, you had to like stop right there. Like if you went past that, then it would become something else, or wouldn't become like the target dish. And everything was just like tasteful. How much salt do you put in this? Oh, well, you just figure it out, and like you feel your way through it. And so you could never get, like, they would try to explain it to you, but you couldn't really capture it in any meaningful way, because it was just their own experience, right, that they used to make something delicious. But it just reminds me, I've been also seeing some lectures by your dad, and there was something he said recently in a short video he put out, like, we know more than we can say, and we can say more than we can write.
Yeah, Polanyi.
And that just really landed. It just clicked for me. I was like, oh, that is so on point. That is so correct.
Yes.
So I know, go ahead. You've been wanting to respond.
No, well, I was funnily enough going to say the same thing, because it's that tacit knowledge, isn't it? And a lot of the time we demand things explicitly from people or from ourselves that maybe can't be made explicit, and when we do, they can be gamed in some way or manipulated in some way. And there is such a beauty to that which cannot be said for me, because when you're giving this example of cooking, all I'm thinking about is how much I want to be in the kitchen with these people and learning and watching them and asking questions and seeing where their eyes go when they're at this point where the milk's checked. There's so much in that is so social, and I think this for me is why the anthropology is so important, why the descriptions are so important, and it comes into how we ask questions of people.
It speaks to the value of apprenticeship, because if I wanted to learn to cook that way, I would have had to spend several rounds of hours and hours just helping them make a thing and kind of like taking over and getting the touch and feel of the consistency of the different things, or the flavors, or like the quantities on my own. And I think it's just sad that like apprenticeship has kind of gone away in favor of more just like tradition, well, more like academic study that is just up in the head, and the body doesn't participate a whole lot in a lot of things that we learn.
I agree. And there are so many implications of this. And this ties back to expert knowledge, doesn't it? Right? Because we live, like, in the last sort of 10, 20 years, there's been this challenge to hierarchy in some ways. And in some ways that's really good, and it's really important. And it's drawn light to some of the unseen stories. And then, as with anything, there's unintended consequences. And, for example, AI. I was listening to a wonderful podcast recently by Josh Schray. He does a podcast called The Emerald. I don't know if you've heard of it. But his kind of hashtag, if you like, is understanding current trends through a mythic lens. And he looks at AI and the innovation going on around generative AI and how it's amplifying and speeding up. And he draws on the kind of stories around The Apprentice. And he said a lot of these innovations are happening from people who haven't apprenticed. They're really young. They're leaders and they're experts in this type of knowledge. But in his words, they've lost the art of wait and see. And knowing when to enter something in and knowing when to act. And there's no rule book for that, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I have somewhat of a difficult relationship with expertise, because on one hand, they can be the expert, say, a doctor that learned medicine in a certain way, versus somebody who has spent a lot of time living with a community and in some type of way that also involves medicine. So let's just say a doctor that has been more like volunteering, hands-on, that has been living in a village, etc. And I think it's not one-to-one expertise, right? So I think that term is something that we have to, or it's very useful to really define and break down, like, well, what does expertise mean? Why, when, where? Like, contextualize it.
Yeah.
Because I think there's lots of experts, like something I found very irritating and frustrating during my studies. Ellie was studying economics, because as much as it's termed as social science, is so divorced from reality in so many ways. It's like, oh, humans work this way, right? It might be some prescription in economics, and it's like, no, that is so wrong in the opposite direction of how human beings really work. And so do you listen to the economics expert, to the quote-unquote expert, or do we get a lot more value out of listening to somebody who has a different kind of expertise built in a different way? So I struggle with that.
But it's really important, because, I mean, expertise itself is quite a fuzzy concept, right? And as you say, it's very contingent. And we talk a lot in Complexity about this idea of bounded applicability. So again, there's no one size fits all. But, you know, depending on the issue, you probably want multiple different types of expertise coming in. You want to put them in dialogue with one another and see what new can come from that, right? But I think, you know, the economics thing is interesting, because a lot of that can fall into the kind of more behavioural understandings of human, right? That, as you say, can decontextualize.
Counted as a behavioural understanding. I mean, it's fantasy. It's not grounded. It's not grounded in any shred of reality whatsoever. It's just something that some people, usually men, thought that was cool and that they were correct.
Yeah, the ivory
And lo and
tower.
behold,
Well, the ivory
it's not
tower
the
of
case.
expertise, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked about embodied knowledge. I just wanted to take a couple more passes at your yoga and massage experience. So is there any other types of meaningful takeaways from practicing massage or yoga that you have taken away for your life, or even the way that you do your work? Has it shaped your work in some way?
Yeah, there's one story when I was doing my yoga teacher training. As I said, it was a very intense experience. And there was an invitation at the start when they were sort of onboarding us into this place that we might want to explore silence for a day, or for a morning, or for an hour. We might just want to write a note, stick it on our bodies and say, I'm having a silent day, don't talk to me. Don't expect a response from me. And as I mentioned, when I came into this space, I was full power, stressed, like doing. And within about a week of this experience, I was exhausted. I'd been around 30 people every day, every night for a week, and they were all strangers, and it was like very overwhelming. So I decided to have a silent day. So I put my sign on and I went through the day. I was in the yoga theory classes where normally I'd have my hand up and I'd ask questions and I'd interrogate and be argumentative, and really annoying anthropology, like I said earlier, dissecting everything. And it was such a revealing experience for me on this theme of noticing, because I had to sit still and I had to explore the sensations in my body where I wanted to jump in prematurely with my understanding of something without fully hearing and exploring the diversity of perspectives in the theory class. in the evening meals. Because at this point, I had entering into the wellbeing industry, having done research on wellbeing and health, I had very political ideas of what it should not be. And I learnt far more in that day of silence than I think I learned in all the study that came up to it, because I was forced to listen. And I will always remember that, because now I'm familiar with that sensation. I can try and, okay, no, Ellie, when are you jumping back into this? When do you need to just open your heart and hear this? And we play around with that quite a lot in our work. We try and ritualize it. So we use things like silent listening techniques. We might use like ritual descent with that, where we have a really senior leader and they basically have to put a mask on or turn their backs. And after they've presented their idea, people have to tear that idea to shreds and they are not allowed to respond at all. Or we have a kind of way of doing a conference where we invite experts in, but then they themselves have to go through that process with other experts responding to them and members who are participating in the audience to do the same. So I think, yeah, that certainly stood out to me as being very powerful, amongst many other things.
Yeah. So I think that just goes to show like the different influences in our lives. And I like to do these explorations because it's not this linear. It's usually, most people don't have a linear path. I studied this, now I work in this, etc. I think life throws many things our way. And it's just really interesting to see, again, as somebody with anthropological curiosities, like what influenced somebody and what meaning did they make out of it, and then like how did they act on that and so forth. So thank you so much for going there with me. So coming back to present day, you work, as I mentioned before, applied anthropologist. You use the software tool built by your company called SenseMaker. So I just wanted to hear, and if you can give me like the lay audience version of, so what is SenseMaker and how is it used? Like what benefit do client teams get from it?
So SenseMaker itself is a software. It's a mixed methods tool for doing research, by which I mean it enables the combination of qualitative data or information that people share via narratives, via stories, via other types of qualitative probes that we might design in. The combination of that type of data with quantitative, so patterns and numbers. And the way that we do it, that is very bespoke to the SenseMaker tool, is that essentially, and I'll it's easier to describe this from the participant's perspective actually without a visual aid. But maybe you receive a URL, you're asked to share your story because people are interested in knowing what it's like to live in your community at this moment in time, right? So the first thing that as a participant you're asked to do is to respond to a story prompt. And we design this story prompt in such a way as to place someone in a familiar context where we're trying to prompt for the stories that they are sharing quite naturally in their social groups with their peers. So this might be something like reflecting on what it's like for young people to grow up here. What's one story that you might share with an outsider to your community that helps to describe that? Or, as I shared earlier with the nursing example, what's one story from your last week that you just feel really matters right now and you want to share wider? So we start off in a very open way to gather these kind of descriptive observations. And when we use the word story here, we're meaning something really quite specific because we're talking about this idea of a micro-narrative. So we have the kind of big stories, our myths, our legends, the stories in an organization of who we say we are, our values. And we also have these day-to-day narrations of events. So we ask people to share at that micro level. So this might be like a paragraph or 2 paragraphs, like quite short really. This kind of fragmented sense of working with narrative. And more often than not, we're asking people to share something from their recent experience, because we want to use these stories to get an understanding of the kind of dispositional state. So what's going on in the thick present at this moment in time, because that will give us a little bit more information, a little bit more knowledge from ideally different perspectives around what might be possible for us to do from here, but also what might be likely to happen, whether we like it or not. So we start with this story piece, and we're starting really broadly and openly at this stage because We don't want to, Nora Bateson's phrase always turns out for me here, communication is not just what you say, it's what it's possible to say. So the art of asking questions, right? Mm-hmm. So we want to keep things really open so that we, with our biases, aren't delimiting things at that earlier on process. So you share your story, you might type this, you might audio record it, you might share some pictures to help describe this as well. And then we ask a series of follow-up questions where people are responding to that specific story that they've shared rather than their overall experience. So these might look like a triangle shape where you have 3 concepts or 3 labels on each corner and you have a ball in the middle. And you're asked, where does your story sit between these 3 themes or ideas? So you drag and drop. So that might be something like, if we're talking about justice, for example, justice is a really fuzzy concept. It can mean different things that are right or wrong in different scenarios too. So we might have, in my story, justice was seen as something that was more punitive, more restorative or preventative. So these might be an example of 3 labels, and they say where their story sits between them. And kind of some of the ideas behind that is to increase the cognitive load a little bit in terms of your response. So you are offered this space to quite deeply reflect on that experience that you've had or that story that you've shared. And maybe we might have around 3 of those type questions where the kind of core idea is that we're abstracting some core concepts that might be in some way modulating people's experiences in this context within our set of objectives that are high enough, that are abstract enough in the way that we have mapped them out in the questions that they can take on a multiplicity of meanings depending on the granularity of those experiences. And then we also have things like sliding scales that you might want to use Likert scale style questions for. But of course you have that deep context behind them, and multiple choice questions. And in terms of what then comes out of that, on those triangle shapes, on those sliding scales, we get heat map outputs. So we get a sense of the density of where the responses lie. And when we explore these, we can look at the kind of bird's eye view. We can look at dominant patterns. We can also look at outlier patterns, which tell us something, right? We don't lose sight of that as we might do in more traditional statistical type research. We can also, as well as looking at it from that bird's eye approach, start to filter things down to look at things and differences between different roles, different perspectives, people who have felt a certain way, whether that be positive or negative about the experience they've shared. So it's a real act of kind of playing and exploring when it comes to looking at the data itself. And there's various ways that you can go about doing that. We have an analysis platform where you're presented with what comes through, but that is really crucially designed in such a way that with the images and stories, anyone can make sense of it. You don't need a degree in statistics or anthropology or any kind of research methodology or skills, right? So normally we would encourage people who are working with the tool to then bring some element of collective sense making into that analysis, into that interpretation. So there's many stages and layers of interpretation that take place. First of all, with that storyteller doing that for themselves, and then with anyone who's involved in that analysis process, which might be, by the way, be some of the participants in the first place as well, to make sense of it in different ways. And then from there, typically, we might move into a bit of an insight to action phase where we're working with people to design some kind of safe to fail experiments, some small scale ideas that they have for change that they can do within their sphere of influence or agency, or that they feel someone else might be able to do. And the way that we would configure that would really kind of depend on the context and who we're working with. It might be quite small scale, or it could be working with 1,000 stories and different workshops with different kind of cohorts, depending on who's involved.
So I'm just curious, do you have a story? Do you remember a time where you've been using SenseMaker in a workshop with the client team and there being some breakthrough in understanding or some ahas? Does such a story come up for you right now? And better yet, if it's in the healthcare space.
I do, and I have one in the health. So I was actually working in a research hospital setting with loads of medical anthropologists. So I was really excited and fangirling, but also quite terrified because they were the real experts in anthropology, right? And they're a wonderful team to work with. but they were interested in hearing the experiences of teenagers and young adults who had been through cancer clinical trials. Because this kind of group, when we're teenagers, are in a slightly liminal space, and that we're not children, we're not adults. How do we get treated, right? We still need some care. So they wanted to understand the kind of specific needs of this age bracket, with the view to encourage more teenagers who had been recently diagnosed with cancer to take part in research studies. And we designed a SenseMaker in a very participatory way. We had some teenagers involved in pulling the questions together based on their experiences. We had researchers and clinicians. It was a very diverse team of experts in all senses of the term that we've been kind of unravelling. And coming towards the end of this process, which took place over a few different months, we had gathered the data through the tool, the stories and the patterns. We did a sense-making workshop with some of the teenagers and young adults and asked them to look at the stories from clinicians and from their peers and to share their thoughts and their interpretations and then their questions for a workshop that then came afterwards with the clinicians and the researchers. And we put the output for this all over the walls and we gave them various activities to work through. And there was one particular question around decision-making and agency. And of course, this is always a big question in a lot of the healthcare stuff because of the impetus on patient-centred care. And I remember this medical anthropologist looked at this, and it was a simple pattern where we had shown the difference between how the teenagers interpreted something and the researchers interpreted something. And it was really stark. It was almost opposing. And this researcher looked at it and she said, so we think that we've been doing shared decision-making, but this would indicate that we maybe need to interrogate what we mean by that, right? And that moved on to other things that weren't necessarily captured in that particular workshop, but it opened something up. It gave a possibility for seeing things in a different way. And I just love that example because it came from an anthropologist as well, so it feels more meaningful.
So good. I'm wondering if you would have 2 or 3 pieces of advice to offer a leader who's struggling with very complex problems. Like, what might you say to such a person? How might they start to navigate the problem in a more productive way? What do you think would be the beginning step or two to kind of start heading in a more useful direction?
Yeah. I guess for me, it's always about making things more granular and doing that by inviting in different perspectives. And I feel like I say that on repeat. But if you're a really senior leader in an organization, especially if it's a really vast, big organization, the chances are when information makes its way to you, it's been played in certain ways, it's been manipulated, it's been mediated, it's been changed. So what you see isn't necessarily what's really going on. Also, if you speak to people directly, well, whatever their role is, whatever seniority or junior type role they're filling, your positionality within the social ecology is going to change what it's possible for them to say again, right? Your story changes my story. Another wonderful quote from Nora, who I just love and probably paraphrase far too much. So it's finding ways to widen those perspectives whilst accounting and acknowledging the power dynamics, right? So a lot of workshop methods, you end up seeing 1 or 2 people really dominating. Some people are really silent because they're a little bit afraid to speak because they don't know how it will land. You might say as a leader, look, I want everyone to be really open and honest, but like maybe 50% of people actually will. So a lot of our stuff works a little bit with this idea of anonymity as well. So bringing different perspectives in, understanding the social scaffolding through which interactions and what it's possible for you to see take place, and finding ways to maybe interrogate that and shift things up. Yeah, would maybe be my first step.
Yeah, or just call Ellie. Hire kuh-nev-in. The shortcut. So Ellie, so the name of this project is Making Business Art. Just wonder what comes up for you when you hear that phrase. What meaning do you make out of that?
I love it as a phrase because when I think of business, sometimes the connotations of it can feel like a machine or like a rush or units and numbers and productivity for the sake of productivity. And making business art for me is this invitation not to romanticize what working life might look like, but to find ways to make it meaningful and human. And I think a lot of the time, our working environments don't necessarily do that. And it happens in quite granular and interesting ways, like blocking our time out into hours or emails or Slack and all these different things. So making business art for me makes me think about reflecting on that from a more human perspective, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. I just wonder what other thoughts you have about humanizing business, and is there anything else that we haven't touched on in this conversation yet that you try to bring forth or do or practice or hold space for in your own work or life to nudge for the humanization of business in some way?
I guess the thing that's feeling into at this moment in time around that is this idea of trust, which you've kind of brought up before. There are so many different ways of structuring organizations now, and I think that's really beautiful. But I think a lot of the time we don't necessarily build in the conditions for trust to take place, and some of that is to do with the fact that we're working to a very large scale. We have a lot of information, a lot of activity that needs to channel in certain ways, and we can't look at all of it because that would be really overwhelming. But, you know, I feel very lucky in my place of work that we define our own hours, we work remotely. So I feel a sense of agency around my time and my place. I do not have to record hours, which I greatly appreciate. I used to spend 2 hours a week just recording my hours because there were so many different ways to do it in an old job. I'm trusted to get on with something. And I think trust is a really interesting concept because it's almost quite paradoxical in that we associate trust with risk in some ways. But at the same time, to trust... Oh, and transparency, trust and transparency. We can trust something if we can see how it's come to be. But also to trust requires stepping into a level of ambiguity, potentially, or understanding why you are or are not comfortable to do that. Yeah, and I think some of that's individual. Some of that, as I say, is in the way that we kind of scaffold our working days. But I feel like that's just opened up such a can of worms for me that I want to go off and read all the Anthropology of Time stuff now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I have a firm belief that trust is the foundation to real, lasting prosperity. And prosperity in the broadest mean possible. Again, like where I come from, personal safety is a concern. So people of means live in these walled, closed communities with barbed wire, etc. And you usually have to be very hyper vigilant when you're driving, when you're out and about. Something going to happen to you, especially now. Society in Ecuador, unfortunately, has become very violent. And even somebody who has a lot of money, I don't feel, when I go visit, I don't feel prosperous in the sense of having to step out into the world and be worried. Versus my life here in the States, things happen, but I can step out of my house with a fancy camera and go take pictures, and I'm not really concerned. And that in itself is a form of prosperity, a form of peace, right? A form of well-being. And I think about prosperity as well-being overall. So anyway, so yeah, we can do a whole other 3 hours talking about trust and unpacking that. But it's just very interesting and very happy that you brought that up because I meant to mention it before, but it's so important.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm really liking about the way kuh-nev-in works is that I see, on one hand, that there's just a great deal of care put into that. I think your dad is a very smart fellow. He could be making a lot of money doing other things that have to do with software and technology and whatnot, but he chooses to do this type of work and to do it in a way that, as we touched upon today, it opens doors to opportunity to make something else possible that's hopefully healthier and more balanced for all stakeholders involved and not just for a very narrow band of people. So kudos to you and the whole team for that. I just find your work lovely. Ellie, so we've reached the end of our conversation. I have a very quick lightning round.
Ooh.
And then I'll open up space for you to share whatever it is that you have going on. And some of the questions in the lightning round might be a little silly. You're feel free to pass, but I do invite you to play. You ready?
Yes.
Okay, so first question is, this is a little bit of an ethnographic question, by the way. Can you describe your closet and what state it's in?
So, at the moment, it's two-tiered and it is all over the place. It's very vibrant. I had a year where all my clothes were packed away in boxes, so I purposely got myself a rail that is open, it's not closeted, and I work at a lot of festivals and wellbeing areas, so it's very colourful, and it brings me joy looking at it.
Very nice. Any approach to organization, or is just kind of organic?
Organic, free-flowing.
I love that. You mentioned this before, but let's circle back here. What's the last piece of media that you loved? That could be a book, a movie, a podcast, or anything else.
Okay, so I am reading this wonderful book at the moment by Andreas Weber called Matter and Desire. And it is he's a biologist and a philosopher. And it is story, it's meditation, it's science. I dip in and out of this in a very random, non-linear way, and his writing brings me great joy. Andreas Weber.
Excellent. What is something that inspires you?
At the moment, it is people who make complex theory and ideas into poetry. So the people that almost through their words create this kind of aphorism where you read two sentences and you're like, whoa, I need to go off and think about what that means. For me, that is just so powerful, and I gained so much more than reading a 30-page academic article. Although I need both. But yeah.
Nice. What's a band or song you must play during a solo road trip?
Oh, I actually have a road trip playlist that is full of 90s songs, and I've called it Songs to Sing To because I absolutely love singing in the car on a road trip. So which is one that I would highlight from there? Maybe something by the Cardigans.
Okay. Great. Last question is, what do you want to see more of in the world?
Ooh. This is a really big question. Hard for me to answer right now, but I'm going to just say spaces that are warm and welcoming, where there's not a predefined tone that you're supposed to take, that, much like this conversation, invite you into a conversation that helps you see things and draw the dots in different ways.
Excellent. Well, that's it for our conversation today. So what do you have going on that you want to share with the audience, and where can people find you?
So you can find us by Googling kuh-nev-in, so Cynefin, and you can come straight to our website. We have all sorts of trainings in some of our workshop methods designed to support strategy or working with narrative that are all on our website that happen throughout the year if anyone is interested or just wants to give us a shout to ask us a few more questions. And in terms of events, we do have a couple of exciting events planned for this year. We'll be running something that we call a triopticon, which is our kind of way of doing a conference that invites 3 expert eagles, as we call them, to talk on a specific subject. And then there's ways that we make that very participatory so that everyone who takes part as an attendee has an opportunity to share. So we like to do things a little bit differently and play around with power dynamics and tease with them and acknowledge them and all sorts. So we're running one actually on AI, because it's such a huge topic at the moment and we need to do a lot more kind of thinking around this. We'll be looking at governance and the ethics of AI. I'm not sure on the exact dates, but I think it's around June time, and it's going to be in Snowdonia in Wales, but I can share the exact details with you afterwards to pop in the show notes.
And I will link to kuh-nev-in's website in the show description, so people can also jump in there, and there's a very rich blog. And I think a lot of content there that people who are inclined to study more about it, they can go and consume quite a bit of things in there. Ellie, thank you so much for carving out time to be on the show today. I really appreciate it. And it's just been such a delight to speak with you.
Thank you so much. I love your style of questioning. And yeah, really lovely to have been a part of this. And thank you.
Excellent. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.